10 years ago, Canada became the first country in the world to establish a national standard for psychological health and safety in the workplace. There are now 30 countries that have taken similar approaches. We'll talk with someone who was in the room when the standard was created in Canada on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Safety at work is more than freedom from physical injury. To be safe, you have to feel safe. Join us each week as we discuss psychologically healthy and safe work in the USA.
Well, welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies that could potentially reduce harm and significantly reduce vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. One of my dreams as host of this podcast is to someday see the United States as a place where psychosocial hazards are recognized as a thing. And one of the areas and one of the circumstances that actually gives me hope is learning from what other people around the world are doing. Now, it can be argued that there aren't a lot of places on the earth who've done a better job at this than my neighbors up in Canada. As a matter of fact, this year marks 10 years since the adoption of the national standard of Canada for psychological health and safety in the workplace. It was created by the Mental Health Commission of Canada, and the standard has been established as a foundation that has now spread to 29 other countries around the world. And so again, most of the guests on this podcast are folks from the U.S. because, what I'd rather not hear is people say, that's just going on in other countries. We really couldn't do that. And so I try to have folks from the U.S. But every now and then I just got to do it a little bit different because there are some things that we don't have here yet. And I want to try to create some inspiration that it's possible. And so this episode, we're going to be talking about the fact that our neighbors up north did it. So can we? And I couldn't think of a better person to have. My guest for this episode is an extraordinary friend and colleague in this work. And she's known as the godmother of psychological health and safety in Canada. She was also one of the catalysts for me even starting this podcast and getting into this work. And it's going to be cool to talk to her. So I start each of these episodes off with a question. And today the question is, who is Mary Ann Bayton?
Besides the godmother, which is a lot of connotations for me because I'm also Sicilian. So it's an interesting juxtaposition there. But David, I'm most importantly a friend, a mother, somebody who's trying to make the best out of this life. And the fact that I get to work in a field where we're striving to make things better, where I get to connect to people with that mindset, really just gives me so much privilege, so much positive energy in my life. And I know I'm going off topic here because it's not about me, but when you say, Canada has done it well, even though we may be polite, that may be true. We also have conflict. We also have bullying. We also have mobbing. We also have personality clashes. We also have people with mental health issues struggling to get along. We also have stigma and discrimination and lack of equity. So what I want to say about that is, yes, psychological health and safety has the significant potential of reducing harm to employees' well-being. But here's the secret sauce to it. It also supports organizational success and excellence. So employers don't have to choose between being nice and polite, like the stereotypical Canadian, or being wildly successful in chasing the American dream. Those two things are both supported with psychological health and safety, because if you can optimize the energy and focus of every employee on every single day, their bad days and their good days, if you're optimizing their energy and focus, your organization will win.
Well, that's actually good to hear. It's good to hear. I wouldn't necessarily characterize the U.S. as a place that's always polite. But the fact that folks that we perceive or that say that they are polite are also honest enough to say that they have issues, I think is actually encouraging, because I don't necessarily see this conversation about psychological health and safety as a question about whether or not a person is polite, or even some days when you have those emotions that come across as angry to other people. I believe that you can do that in such a way that is understood by the other person, and that our relationship doesn't have to fall apart just because we're not feeling it today. I guess that's something that someone who's been married for 35 years would have to say, because there are some days when, I'm pretty sure my wife doesn't like me and I don't like her either. But what we have is a relationship and an understanding that one day doesn't define us, and there's the opportunity to do it different tomorrow. So why don't we start off with kind of a softball for those who might be, because I get folks who pop in every now and then, they have no idea what that psychological health and safety thing means, or they're kind of confused by all the other terms. So share with us what is psychological health and safety? What does that mean to you?
Do you know, when the technical committee sat around a table, so 30 some leaders sitting around a table talking about psychological health and safety, what came out was, this is not rocket science. What this is how we treat each other at work. That's all it is. However, people say, well, I'm just being passionate, or I was just frustrated, or I'm having a bad day, or this is your job and you need to do it, I'm the boss. And so the way we treat each other is always through our own filters. And what psychological health and safety is saying is, let's be more conscious of the impact rather than just the intention. And in the same way, in Canada at least, there was a time in the 1800s where occupational safety, so physical safety, was considered the responsibility of the employee. You fell, you got hurt, you're gone. You can't do your job, you're out of here. And then there was an understanding that some of that is within the responsibility, the influence, and the control of the employer. Psychological health and safety is the impact on the mental well-being of employees that is within the influence, control, and responsibility of the employer. It's got nothing to do with genetics. It's got nothing to do with other things that are going on for that person, but neither is exposure to hazardous chemicals got to do with whether or not you have asthma. But we need to protect you from being harmed in the workplace. Well, if you have depression, we need to protect you from being harmed from psychosocial hazards in the workplace, the same as we would for everyone else.
Wow. Okay, we just went to school, folks. and a key to what you said is where the employer has responsibility can actually make a difference. Because I often when these conversations come up, people go from the sublime to the ridiculous. Oh, there's no way in the world we could ever be concerned about how people are feeling all the time. Well, that's not the point. The question is, can you create an environment at work where it's better? Can you, because these issues are going to come, as I and other people will say, is that when you bring the whole person, you bring the whole person, including things that you may not want them to bring with them. They bring it anyway because it's who they are. And we do have an opportunity in the workplace to do some things that sometimes folks can't do at home. And a lot of folks even learn about safety in general at work they don't necessarily, this is not something that you come out of the crib knowing how to do.
No. I've had a lot of reaction to people saying, bring your whole self to work. Because what if my whole self is a negative, cranky, critical, miserable person? That's who I am today. What we say is psychological health and safety is saying you can be you, but the behaviors that we're going to exhibit at work are going to be clearly defined, and how we're going to hold each other accountable for it is going to be clearly defined. It doesn't mean that you can cause harm to other people. And I say to employers, it doesn't matter how great your policies, your processes, even your leadership training is. If the employees are not treating each other in a psychologically safe way, you will never have a psychologically safe workplace. This is why, for us, unions must be involved, employees must be involved and held responsible. It is a whole organization approach, not a top-down approach.
Right. So I just mentioned that coming out of the crib, I'd imagine that there was a time in your life when you knew little or nothing about this topic. So share a little bit about your journey to this kind of work. What were you doing before this, or this is something that you've always done?
So I was working for the Canadian Mental Health Association in workplace mental health, and I was helping managers when one of their employees would have a mental illness. So whether it was bipolar, addiction, depression, anxiety, and I would help that manager to support the employee to stay a contributing member. So that was my job. But what I started to see in these cases that I was involved with is that in some workplaces, the task was pretty easy. And in some workplaces, it was like swimming upstream. So, and the difference I noticed was that, and I didn't have the language for it then, but in a workplace where everybody was supported to be successful on the job, a person with a mental illness could easily be supported. In an organization where there was chronic conflict, lack of civility, where there was competition that was nasty, that was getting out of hand, then it was really difficult to support somebody who was also struggling with a mental illness. Because of that, I thought, okay, I'm putting out fires. What if I looked at prevention? What would that be if we went further upstream? And I started looking at leader training, right? How could we create leaders who made it more possible for people to be at work on their more difficult days? And then from there, I said, well, what about organizations? What could we do to change the way they impact? And I was very fortunate to know Dr. Martin Shane, who is an academic lawyer who is very interested in civility, respect. He has an organization called Neighbor at Work. We don't have to be best friends, but we need to know you got my back if something went wrong. I need to be able to say hi to you every day. And so that's his concept. And then to work with researchers to come up with Guarding Minds at Work, which was a way that employers could assess psychosocial risks and hazards without spending six figures, because employers don't have the money. So that got put into the public domain. And actually, it's available for Americans too. It's available for anybody. So now we have an approach that is free, that is evidence-based, that is available to everyone. Then we went to the Canadian Standards Association and said, rather than this little resource that's available for free and was funded by an insurance company, Canada Life, what if we had an arm's length, consensus-based process to create a standard that was more credible and inclusive? And so 10 years ago, the National Standard of Canada on Psychological Health and Safety in the Workplace was born. And the rest is history.
The rest is, in fact, history. Interesting you'd mentioned history. So this episode will be released during Women's History Month. And so again, it was not by accident that you're one of the guests. As a matter of fact, for the entire month of March, all of my guests will be women. And they're all women that I have met that have made some sort of contribution. And if I were to ask most of them, they won't say it was history making. Okay, I will. I was, but so do you think, let's go into that for just a second. Do you think your perspective as a woman influenced how you see psychological health and safety? Or share a little bit about, is there a connection, do you think?
You know, it's funny because going back probably 20 years, I realized that all of the work around men and women thinking differently was impeding some of the work around dealing with people with mental health issues. And it's because some of the people that we're trying to help were saying, you, male leader, should become touchy-feely and emotionally empathic. And it was like, I don't do that at home. And you want me to come to work and do this with people I hardly even know? Are you kidding me? And so I became curious about what could I do for the concrete linear thinker? Because we know it's not just men. There's women that are concrete linear thinkers, right? And to help them get it in a way, because they were being traumatized by dealing with somebody who then either had a meltdown or exploded, became volatile, started crying. And I was watching these leaders just get completely burned out and overwhelmed. And so what could I do? And what I did is I read up about personality types. I read up about different types of social intelligence, emotional intelligence. And I realized that if we can present the information in a factual, concrete, step-by-step way, then those concrete linear thinkers would get it, and the touchy-feely people would put their own spin on it.
Oh, okay.
But what came from that, David, is that sometimes the bleeding heart unintentionally does harm too. If we just feel sorry for, feel pity for somebody who's struggling, we keep them the victim. We keep them dependent. Whereas if we can have that middle ground, which is, what is it you need to be able to do your job well and go home at the end of the day with some energy left over? Not, how can I make you happy for the rest of your life? How can I cure your illness? How can I be your best friend? How can I, to make it, let's stay in that middle ground. You help them to be successful at work, and you connect them to resources for other things, financial issues, family issues, relationship issues, mental health issues, physical health issues. Don't you give advice to somebody who is under your power and control, because there's strings attached. And then the second question I say that they should ask is, what are you going to do differently to support your own success? And a lot of leaders think it's all on them. But if we want to give somebody back some sense of control and responsibility for their own well-being, this is a critical question. What are you going to do differently? Are you going to start to get up and go out at lunchtime rather than work through when you know it's going to exhaust you? Are you going to stop interacting with that person in the workplace that triggers you all the time and just be civil and professional and limit your contact? Are you going to, get a stand-sit desk so that you can move around more? Whatever it is, you want it to come from that person in order that they start to see, I can choose what's going to support me. Right. And then I'll just share with you the last question, because we got the first two. The last question from a leader perspective is, if you're having a bad day, if your performance is slipping, if I see you and I think you're not well again, what do you want me to do so that you feel as your leader, I'm supporting you and not harassing you? Because that's my intention, but I need to know from you how you're going to receive it.
Wow. Again, more, I'm not sure if it's going to school or going to church, but they're both wonderful. I really like your comment and focus on, this. A lot of people get kind of wrapped around what people's intention was, and seem to think that if I have the right intention, I can do whatever I want, and it's great for the other person. And not so much. Often it just really depends on how it lands with that other person. And it's this back and forth between what I intended and how the person received it. And so we've got to have that continuous dialogue because, again, sometimes, as you said, people are really, I think their heart's in the right place. They really are. They're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to create a safer environment, a happier environment, a more diverse environment. But they're going about it all wrong because they never really ask the other person, how does this work for you? And what is your role in this? And what are you going to do to help yourself?
Yeah. What was your intention for the impact that it would have? And
absolutely.
Yeah. I just want to share with you, David, there's a free resource called Psychologically Safe Interactions. Sure. Which actually gets your group of people to think about the difference between intention and impact. So that somebody else's perspective of what you say or do may be different than your intention, and we need to hold ourselves responsible for thinking about that.
Wow. So again, another free resource, folks. Hopefully you're taking notes on all these free resources that Marianne is talking about. So wow. I've heard you tell this story, but I wanted to have you share it. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you share it is that, again, we are in I'm hopeful that we're in the place that Canada was in, 10, 12 years ago, kind of talking about how we can do a better job around the concept of psychological health and safety. And as you know, I approach this from a purely occupational health and safety perspective, and the fact that how people feel at work is just as important, and in some cases more important, than how they look or whether or not they're having physical pain or whether or not they're exposed to some type of physical hazard. Because I'm finding that a lot of the even accidents, injuries, incidents, whatever we want to call them, if we were to trace them back to a source, there was a psychosocial source and psychosocial root to the physical problem that we finally noticed. So, and from a safety perspective, people do safety-related things for one of three reasons. Either they believe that it is the ethical right thing to do, they believe it's going to save them a buck, or they have to. And from my perspective, it doesn't particularly matter which one is the motivation, as long as it feels safe for people at work. So you've chatted a couple of times about it was kind of like one of those jokes where three people were sitting in a bar. so really the mechanics of how this standard came together, was it really that simple that a few of you thought it was a good idea and were able to convince other people to cause it to happen?
So yeah, I like to start my story that way, which is a doctor, a lawyer, and a social worker walked into a bar. They sat down and ordered a beer, and the doctor said, "My patients are off on stress leave. And when they go back to work, even after I've taken the time with them and helped them and, reduce their anxiety, they go back to work and it's right back where it was before." And the lawyer said, "My clients are saying that they don't know how to protect against mental injury and that they're getting sued more and more for things that are happening to people. And they want to know how to do it." And the social worker said, "So how does that make you feel?" And they slapped her. And then I say, "No, they didn't." But the how does that make you feel does make people cringe. But that really did happen to a certain extent. It was Dr. Ian Arnold, who was the chair of the Workforce Advisory Committee for the Mental Health Commission of Canada. Dr. Martin Shane, who I already mentioned, is an academic lawyer and somebody in the field of workplace mental health, and myself, who's a social worker by training. And we were sitting talking about what can we do now? We have made incremental baby steps because that's how it works. And what could we do now? And we really started to talk about because Ian in particular, the doctor, was an occupational health physician who was very aware of standards and how that had an impact on large organizations taking steps to protect safety. So that's how it really happened, but there were many other people involved. In the book that is called The Evolution of Workplace Mental Health in Canada, towards a standard for psychological health and safety, the whole story of all of the people that were involved, well, maybe not all, because there may be some I didn't know about, but I think we interviewed 108 people. And all of the things that happened to lead up to it, including things around the world, are in that book. And that book is available free for download too. So you don't even have to buy the book if you want to go onto the Workplace Strategies for Mental Health site. But at the end of this year, I'm going to start to do a new version of that book. And what I want to add to it is what's happened in the last 10 years, how the national standard in Canada will change based on the work that an amazing, diverse group of people are doing right now, how the pandemic has impacted psychological health and safety in a positive way, and what the new research says, what we've learned since then.
So, again, sticking with the story, I want to believe that even after the almost magical way it came together, sitting at a bar, I'd imagine there were still probably some challenges in terms of getting the right people or getting before the right audience. So it obviously happened, but share a little bit about what that journey was like. I mean, did you all just call some folk up and say, let's have a meeting, or some of the mechanics that caused the standard to actually happen?
There's so much serendipity, right? These lovely coincidences that happen. So prior to us sitting in the bar, we had all worked for decades around this subject, trying to make a difference. And so had many other people. So it really wasn't that magical. We came together, and it was interesting to the diversity of interests. So there was people with mental illness who wanted to be accommodated better in the workplace. There were leaders who wanted to be able to support performance better. There were organizations who wanted to have organizational excellence and not be putting out fires all the time and dealing with things like that. There were policymakers who wanted policies to do no harm and knew that they had to be changed in order to think of the unintended negative consequences to the mental health and psychological safety of people. So there were clinicians that wanted the workplace not to undo all the work they were doing with patients. So there's lots of different interest groups came together. In terms of financing, because it probably cost near $500,000 to create the standard.
Really?
And we had a close personal friend of Dr. Arnold's, Ian's, was a senator in the Canadian government who lobbied for over a year in order to get the funding to pay for this. So that was an important piece. There were organizations like Canada Life and Bell Canada who also chipped in order to support this. And then it was the volunteering, because the Canadian Standards Association is consensus-based. So there's only one way to do it, which is you get a group of people They have what they call a balance matrix. Got nothing to do with Keanu Reeves. It's got to do with making sure no one interest group can dominate. Mm-hmm. For instance, we had 3 union representatives on our committee. Amazing human beings, but they, in some cases, seemed to be outnumbered, but the group wanted their perspective heard and would stop and say, if all 3 of you disagree with it, we're not comfortable going forward. So let's talk it through. Let's find a way. And so we laugh about it because we worked so hard, all of us, to do this, but we did it in a psychologically safe way. So we walked the talk as we were creating it.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
Yeah, that sounds very familiar. Similar to the ANSI process here in the U.S. I've had opportunity to participate in the National Fire Protection Association's development of a handful of standards. And it's that same way. The intent is to have the standard balanced in terms of interests, and you'll still never get everybody in the room. It's just not possible because there are too many folks in Canada, too many folks in the U.S., too many folks in the world. But it's important to have the interest there at the start, because if you start bad, you're going to end up worse. If you start at least going in a good direction, it'll get better. It won't be perfect, but it'll get better, as you continue to refine it. So for those, again, for the most part in the U.S. who may not have heard of the standard, can you share a little bit about some of the basic tenets of how the standard is constructed?
Yeah. So it's Plan, Do, Check, Act. And I don't know if everybody knows what that means, but it's, first of all, you assess where you are now. So you get a baseline. Where are we and what are we doing? And then you create a plan, an implementation plan, so that you say, what do we want to change and how will we measure success? So not, let's all just, do unicorns and rainbows and hope for the best. Or it's a very concrete approach. And then you implement, and in the standard, there's a few guiding principles that are critical. That employees must have meaningful participation at all levels, at the evaluation, at the planning, at the implementation, all the way through. So you implement it and you measure whether or not it had the intended impact. So you don't we call them smile sheets. You don't do just, did you have a good time today at this session or with this thing? But you're actually measuring, did it change whatever we intended to change it? And another really important guideline is this isn't lunch and learns and guest speakers. This is, did you change the way people behave at work? And if you're not changing the way people interact, you are not successful. That this is not sit and passively learn something and then go back to what you did before. The standard also has different components. So for instance, with leadership, and I'm paraphrasing these, but it says, if you manage, support, or lead people, then you ought to be able to do it in a psychologically safe way. If you investigate critical incidents, you must do so in a psychologically safe way. If you are managing performance, creating a termination or layoff plan, you need to do so in a psychologically safe way. If you're involved in collective bargaining, union and management, you should do so in a psychologically safe way. So it gets to the nitty gritty. But I can tell you that there's some organizations that go, okay, did that document, we have that policy, okay, we're done. But that's not the intention.
Right. And the standard, as I understand it, is revised every 5 years. So you're at the second kind of revision cycle. Do you see any major? I don't know how much of this you can share, whether it's proprietary or not. But do you see anything changing significantly, or simply improvements on what's been there for the last 10 years?
I think there's significant improvements on what's been there in the last 10 years. So we're trying not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So even though we're passionate about some changes related to things like vicarious trauma, things like burnout, or things like inclusion, diversity, and equity, these things in the last 10 years have been more crystallized for us, and we want to be more definite about them in the standard. Not that they weren't always intended, but to be more specific. We also want to align with ISO 45003 and ISO 45001, because we don't want individuals having to do both. So we want it to align so that if they use the Canadian standard, they will be in compliance with that as well. And that's what we did with Guarding Minds. Is Dr. Heather Stewart, who's out of Queen's University, she took the items related to the psychosocial factors and tracked them to the psychosocial hazards. So if we can say it this way, a factor is a continuum. So if the factor is psychological support, if you have it in the positive, it's a protective factor. If you have it in the negative factor, in the negative way, it can be a hazard. But with Guarding Minds, we try to be in the positive, because we know that a negative survey can create more discontent, can create a very negative experience. So we want it to primarily be in the positive, but we give the hazard ratings to the employer anyways. So the questions are asked primarily in the positive, but the employer gets both the negative and the positive result.
Sure.
So those, I think, the alignment, stress and trauma, inclusion, those are sort of the main things we want to look at. We want to tighten some things up. We want to not make it more difficult. Right. And we also want to make it so that people who have been doing this for 10 years don't say, now we got to start all over.
Right. Yeah, I think that's really important, because I have seen and have honestly, if I'm honest, and because I like new things, I enjoy new endeavors and new activities and getting better and all that type of thing. But I think I've learned as I've had more birthdays, the value of keeping some things in place because they are comfortable for people, because they are easier and more relatable for people, and not, I could run off at 100 miles an hour, but that's going by myself. There's an African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So it's important to bring people along in the process and not simply assume that, well, they don't get it, and they'll catch up with me eventually. That's not leadership to me. It really isn't. That's performance. That makes it all about you. But if it's really about us, it's about the organization, about the group, about the system, then we have to go there together, which means, yeah, it might go a little slower in terms of time than you want, but it's better, and it's healthier, and it's actually safer. I believe it is.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And a really important principle of the standard, which you would know because you understand occupational health and safety, is that this is not a one and done. This is continual improvement. You don't go in and make sure people have their hard hats and their steel-toed boots and that ladders aren't sitting there and say, okay, I'm done. We never have to look at safety again.
Right.
Psychological health and safety is the same thing. It's continual.
It is. It is in fact. It is in fact. And another point that comes to mind, and there are, not to get into a huge debate about it, but I think that there is almost a fad out there now. So folks have taken Dr. Amy Edmondson's work and run off with it and talked about, if psychological safety is this kind of nirvana place where we can all get there and everything's going to be wonderful. But after the commercial is over, people don't really have the fundamental building blocks to be able to get there. So it looks nice. And it's honestly, I believe in their work. I really do. I believe in engagement, bringing the whole self. I think that's really important. But people don't know how to do it, because if they did, we wouldn't be having the conversation in the first place. And to your point, even once you get there, you won't stay there unless you continue to pay attention to these, which psychosocial hazards are people being exposed to on a regular basis. And, I love that conversation about psychosocial factors being a spectrum. It's just so important to continue to pay attention, which is why, 10 years of this standard are so important. You're continuing to look at it, continuing to make sure it is effective, not just a poster or a label or something or a merit badge that people can get. So is there a difference between when people say psychological safety and psychological health and safety? Are they talking about something different?
So it's no different than personal safety versus occupational health and safety, right? If I am somebody who is stumbling around and I'm not careful, then personally, I'm not safe. So you could have all of the policies and processes you want in the world, and it's still not going to keep me safe or the people around me. Psychological safety and the work of Amy Edmondson is, what am I doing internally to be able to be in a place where I can feel safe and I can operate in the world? That's got to do with my psyche, my mental health, my treatment. But if I'm in a workplace that doesn't protect me, that's the piece that psychological health and safety is within the influence, control, and responsibility of the employer. Amy Edmondson's psychological safety has more to do with my internal processes, which is impacted by the workplace, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, another example of not necessarily either or, but both and, because both are important. I mean, if you put a person, an individual who is struggling themselves and simply want the work environment to do it all for them, that won't work. No. Or if you have an employer that says it's all on the employee, that won't work either. They have to be focused from both sides, because we are in this together. Both have a role to play. So if let's say we were able to get Marianne Bayton in front of a group of American policymakers, business people, to convince them that a standard of similar kind of standard would be possible or should be instituted in the United States. What would you share with them?
Okay, don't know if you're going to like this or not, David, but I'll tell you what I'll share with them. I would say start by asking the question, how might this impact the psychological health and safety of our employees? And when I say this policy, this process, this change, this meeting, this event, this performance management system, this interaction, this team building activity, start with getting your heads around that and asking the question. And what you will see is that just having that conversation will start to shift your sense of value in why we want to do this, and the outcomes that you get will shape what you know is possible by doing this. Then, when you have convinced yourselves of the value, you can create a standard that will help others to follow along in your path. It's like you need to start the parade and others will want to then get in front and lead it. But we need those people who know for sure that this is worthwhile for employers, rather than just those of us who are passionate advocates for the employees. So let's build those champions, business people who know beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is good for business. Then they can help create a standard for others to follow.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You've mentioned a couple of times, again, in our various conversations about the role that folks like Canada Life and others have played. So talk a little bit about if you can share a lot of the resources you've talked about over this conversation and prior have been made free because of the support of folks like Canada Life and others. How does that happen? I mean, do they have brothers or sisters here in the U.S.?
I don't know if you have something similar, but we have something called Imagine Canada. And what it is saying it's almost like tithing, because you talk about the church, that organizations should give a certain percentage of their profits to the greater good. And Canada Life gave to the arts, gave to children's charities, gave to research, the usual kinds of things. But when they looked at workplace mental health and psychological health and safety, they didn't see anything to give money to. So what they did is they said, can we create free resources that are evidence-based, that are practical, that are easy for employers to use, and make them available? And to talk about their original impetus, they were part of something called the Global Business and Economic Roundtable on Mental Health and Addictions, which also operated in the States. We were in Boston, Washington, and other places. And they were challenged, as were all of the leaders around the table, to start to take action. Put your money where your mouth is. Do something. So some people gave to hospitals or mental health charities or things like that. And this was what Canada Life decided to do. Let's make a real impact by providing the things that most employers say they don't have the time, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the budget to do it. Let's take away the excuses or reasons why they can't or don't take action, because they're valid. They're valid reasons and excuses. They're busy. I always say one of the things that's really bad for our mental health is unemployment. So if leaders are not focused on sustaining their organizations so that people have jobs, they're going to do more damage to our mental health. So we want them to focus on that. And in the last year, I went around talking about motivating the powers that be. And that's going to be available this summer, David. And I suggest you look at it because you can use this to talk to other people. But basically what it says is, let's stop shoving psychological health and safety down the throats of leaders who are overwhelmed with supply chain issues, with absenteeism due to pandemic, with a lack of talent and all of these things. And instead, let's say to them, what matters to you right now? What are you focused on? What keeps you up at night? And we can help you with that. Now, we can help you with that with a solution that is also going to contribute to psychological health and safety, but we don't have to talk about that. Right. We don't have to say those words which sound like something else to you. You're doing a merger? Let us help to integrate your teams now. Let us help with creating a way of laying people off, because that's almost inevitable, in a really safe way so that they still are ambassadors, still champions for your organization, saying they treated me well. Let us help your employees to be able to embrace constant change that's going to happen over the next year. Now, we know all these things, team building and how you let people go and change management is all about psychological health and safety. But we don't have to say that.
Right.
For the leader who says, all I care about is sales, then we say, great, we know that if we improve the emotional intelligence of your staff, it's directly correlated to sales. We'll do that for you. Now, we also know that if we do emotional intelligence in the right way, it's going to improve psychological health and safety, but we won't say that. We're just working on sales.
Absolutely. Wow. I just love that approach that, and to, not necessarily quote you, but you just recently said it, to not try to shove these things down people's throats, because that's the very thing, at least when I talk about this topic, is that's what we're telling people they shouldn't do, and then we do it. I mean, you gotta do the thing, and no, there are ways of showing people the road, but not necessarily putting the signs up. But you're on the road.
If you think about humans in general, when somebody is dancing as fast as they can, working as hard as they can, and not intentionally, but you shame or blame them, saying you're not doing enough, you're not good enough, you don't care enough, of course we're going to get resistance. Of course we're going to get defensiveness and justification. That's how we roll. So when we're talking to leaders about doing this, we want it to be in their best interest, and we want to appeal to their own desire to be successvel, not appealing to the fact that they might harm people.
Right. Absolutely. Well, Marianne, I'm almost left speechless every time I talk to you anyways, because this is just such an important topic, and I really feel encouraged, to be quite honest, about the conversations going on around the world. I really do. I think that we are on the precipice of a fairly significant change, and when the history books are written, I think that what you all have done in Canada will be one of those seminal moments that, they did it and somebody else, and we'll look around the world and see the positive outcomes and the positive things that have been produced from the work that you all have done. So chat a little bit for those who want to know more about what you're up to, the various groups you're involved in. Pick a couple. They want to get more information about you and what you're doing. How would they do that?
Yeah. So they can go to the contact us on workplacestrategiesformentalhealth.com. That's where all those free resources are, and they can reach me or get a question answered about whatever. But I just wanted to do a shout out. You talk about what Canada has done, but then we look at places like Australia and what Flourish DX is doing there and how they're expanding on some of the things. And I love the reciprocal nature of people taking it further and sharing back ideas with us. And, what's happening in the UK and what's happening all around the world. I think this is one of those things where it's not necessarily competition. It is that we're all there for the greater good. Some do things that are free because they're funded. Some do things at a cost because they're not. But I haven't met somebody in this field who doesn't want to lift humanity up so that we improve working lives, which then improve the lives in the families and communities all around the world.
Well, wow. Yeah, thanks, Marianne. And great shout out to our friends at Flourish DX. And, honestly, just this really short story before we go, the way I met you was through a webinar that Flourish DX was doing when 45,003 first came out. You and some others were on talking about this. And I, of all the folks on there, I go, that lady from Canada, she seems like there was something about your presentation. So I just reached out to you on a lark. And I think we've been friends ever since. But I it is worthy of mention of the, just the community of people, and particularly our friends in Australia that have taken time. So who sponsors a podcast in the United States when you're in Australia and you have really no even business presence there, at least not yet. I think they will at some point, other than, great folks who really do want to see the world be a better place. I'm always appreciative to Jason and Joelle and the folks at Flourish DX for their support, even for this podcast. But, like all good things, they have to come to a close at some point. And so I want to thank you, Marianne, for spending this time with me. I always walk away feeling like, wow, I know a little bit more about this topic that has become a life passion for me as well. And as you know, I certainly approach it from a slightly different, kind of similar, but slightly different perspective. It's all about safety for me. But safety is not just about what you look like. It's actually about how you feel. Ultimately, I think it's all about how you feel. So I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me. And for those who have been watching, if you've been watching us on YouTube, please do like and share and subscribe and all that type of stuff from the YouTube side. If you're one of our subscribers on LinkedIn, either to me personally or to the podcast, please, share that information with your friends and family. And you can go to the podcast, psychhealthandsafetyusa.com, and you can find all the episodes. This will certainly be a wonderful way to close out Women's History Month with, again, the godmother of psychological health and safety in Canada, and a place of prominence around the world. So again, thanks, Marianne, and thanks to all of you. And we'll catch you next time on our next episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Thanks very much.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.